called, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, this is called the AnatomyLab, and it's a story that's semi-autobiographical, and some parts of it may actually be true. It was the first day of medical school, and a medical student, we'll call him Joe, attended the class with all the other 160 medical students at one of the oldest medical schools in North America. And of course, he had orientation, and they told him about all the fun things he would learn in physiology and biochemistry. And then they told him there was also anatomy. Now, he had heard of anatomy because anatomy had the dreaded AnatomyLab, where they would have to dissect cadavers. And this was scary. He was in fear. But he figured he was a medical student and could handle it. So on the day of orientation for the AnatomyLab, he and all the medical students went outside the lab into the changing room where there were lockers and a sink and other things. And the resident gave them some instructions about how this was a sacred gift from the people. They had donated their bodies to science. They were going to be allowed to be cut up so that these medical students could learn and would benefit from this, and how they had to have the deepest respect for the dead. Joe, however, missed that part, because Joe was a little unusual. So they went in, they opened the doors, and there was the AnatomyLab. 16 rows deep, 3 wide, of cold stainless steel tables. And the AnatomyLab was cold because they wanted the bodies to stay preserved. And the AnatomyLab was dark because they hadn't turned the lights on yet. But the AnatomyLab also smelled of formaldehyde, and there was a cold breeze blowing through it. And quite a few of the medical students lost their lunch at this point, but Joe managed to survive. And he and his 4 partners went to their table, and there was a big plastic bag. And they unzipped the bag, and inside was their cadaver. And for the next 6 months, they would learn it intimately, slowly going over. So after a while, Joe was able to handle this. And looking at the cadaver, gross anatomy on the outside, he sort of remembered his class in college about photography. And he thought, yeah, you know, we used to do pictures of cameras close up, macro photography, and it might be interesting. So one day, he brought his camera into the lab and put it in the locker. Now, the lab was so hard and so difficult that they allowed the students to stay in it after hours up till midnight. So one night, when Joe was in studying and learning parts, and there was no one else in the room, he took out his camera and started taking pictures. Now, it was rumored that some of these cadavers had spirits that had stayed behind in the lab and were going to look after them in the future. As a matter of fact, it was believed there were ghosts in the walls that stayed forever, tied to this mortal building where their bodies were previously present. So Joe started taking pictures, and the spirits were not amused. So they gave Joe a few hints. Every now and then a scalpel somewhere else would fall to the ground. There would be a strange breeze, a waft of formaldehyde would attack him, and the lights would go off. But Joe ignored this, kept on taking pictures, little things, earlobes, noses, fingers, very interesting artsy type things. And after a few days, he got bored with that. And he began taking slightly different pictures, a little bit more figure study, farther back, showing the whole body. And again, the spirits were not amused. So they got together and decided something had to be done. So they gave Joe COVID. It was the middle of the COVID epidemic. So Joe got sick and went home and stayed home for 10 days and was sick for 3 days and got very far behind in his studies. particularly anatomy, because he couldn't get into the lab. So once he recovered and quarantine was over, he went back to the anatomy lab and had to start working extra hard, so he stayed extra hours. And he again felt the urge. So again, one night when no one was there, he took out his camera and again started taking pictures. The spirits were not amused. They got together and they gave Joe long COVID. And now Joe had long COVID and couldn't think right. His mind was fogged, he was weak, he was tired. The dean said, Joe, you're gonna have to stop this year, and you'll have to come back next year as a first year because you just can't finish. And Joe was heartbroken, but he took the advice and went home. But the urge still was with him. So one night, he snuck into the lab, even though he was not a student anymore, and started taking pictures. But this time, he began taking some perverse pictures. He put the bodies in different positions. He put women in the Venus pose. He put men in the fig leaf. He even had one cadaver flip the bird. I won't do that. The spirits were absolutely not impressed with this, and they inflicted with Joe a relapse of COVID that was severe. And Joe went to the hospital, and for 3 weeks he fought valiantly. He was given the experimental drugs, he was put on the ventilator, and finally Joe departed this mortal world. Cut to 9 months later, when there was another anatomy class, and the new students had trepidation about going into the anatomy lab because they had heard there were ghosts there. So the students went in with the usual vomiting and fear, and 4 students went to their assigned cadaver, and they noticed he looked very young and very fit and very strong. And they couldn't quite figure out what it was. But then they noticed there was a look of horror on his face, as if he had died under horrible circumstances. And they behaved very carefully from then on because they knew the spirits of the anatomy lab were watching them, including the newest spirit.
Anybody else would like to tell stories tonight? No?